started. I'd like to welcome everybody to our Monday night speakers, and we like to have them at the museum itself, but we knew it'd be a little bit warm tonight. So we thank the Senior Center for allowing us to have it down here. We do pay a little bit of a fee, but not bad. So if you want to donate to that cause, we've got a donation jar over there. And then I wanted to let you know, don't forget the brochures that are over there. We have a little card thing about our museum, and there's a building fund campaign if you are interested, and a form for membership. So they're found on that entrance table, and if you didn't sign in, please make sure that you do, because we are benefited by letting Humanities Kansas know that the speakers that we get are well attended, and this looks great. Thank you so much for coming. Humanities Kansas, I need to tell a little bit about them. They're an independent nonprofit leading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. So Debbie couldn't be here tonight, but she helped to write the grant to get Humanities to come tonight. So please take a time, turn off your cell phones so we can all enjoy the presentation. If you need a restroom anytime, they're kind of past that cabinet over there about where you entered if you're interested. And then after the presentation, there's water and some refreshment, some good cookies and brownies. And I thank Debbie and Mary for our members for bringing those. So, about Will, this is what they sent, so I will read it. Director of Engagement and Learning for the Watkins Museum of History in Lawrence. He earned a PhD in history from the University of Kansas, contributed to the public history projects including the New York Times, Truman Library Institute, and the Kansas City Public Library. Will's varied task as a public historian at the Watkins Museum of Volunteers. He contributes with research and text for exhibits and finding new ways to enhance the museum experience for visitors. Outside of his museum work, Will is working on 2 Civil War history book projects. So please welcome Will Haynes.
Imagine that you suddenly awaken from a deep sleep. It's barely dawn, yet you hear galloping horses, shouts, gunfire, and crackling fires, and screaming outside of your house. Then there's a furious pounding at your door. You get out of bed and walk to the door, telling your spouse and children to stay back. You open the door and are confronted first by the smell of fires, then by a group of dusty, long-haired, wildly dressed, heavily armed men. If you're a man, they probably shoot you dead in your own doorstop or drag you outside to be shot. If you're a woman, they demand you hand over all money and valuables. They say you have 5 minutes before they'll torch your home. You look back at your family members, then around the parlor. Will you bargain with these frightening men for more time to spare your possessions? Do you spend your time trying to sneak your male family members out the back windows or back doors of the house? And what property will you hand over to these guerrilla fighters? What family heirlooms and valuables, carefully husbanded on a long journey across the prairie, will you try to take out or conceal on your person? And what will you consign to the flames? These were the dilemmas that confronted the residents of Lawrence, Kansas, on the morning of August 21st, 1863, exactly 160 years ago today. And the Confederate raid that destroyed their town that day and killed at least 150, perhaps as many as 200 residents, was a nightmare that loomed as a possibility in the minds of all Kansans during the Civil War. And it was a possibility that many Kansans hoped to bring to the people of Missouri and other states where there was a significant percentage of Confederate sympathizers. Yet for Kansans, the Civil War was not only a period of danger and fear, but one of pride and opportunity as well. Their young state emerged from this conflict with a much larger population and economy, and ready to take on the challenges and the opportunities of the post-war era. In researching and writing this topic, I tried to approach it not from the perspective of me in the 21st century, but through the eyes of the people who lived through these events and in some cases died during these events. This is the best and really the only way, in my opinion, that you can recapture something of what it must have felt like to experience a deadly war, in some cases literally on one's own doorstep, as Kansans did. The popular narrative of the war on the Kansas-Missouri border in particular, which is a particularly hot area of the war for Kansans, has been colored by partisanship and distortions, in some cases outright lies, ever since it began. And some people still feel very strongly about these topics. And I've seen presentations, I've never given a presentation where this happened, but I've seen some where some audience members get up and leave the room because they don't agree with what the speaker is saying. If you feel the need to do that, that's perfectly fine. Some people get defensive when their notions of what happened during the Civil War get challenged. It's a topic that some people are still quite emotional about. All of that I can assure you is that everything that I'm going to tell you here tonight is based on research, is based on my research and the research of other historians, looking mostly at primary sources, the words of the people who lived through these events themselves. And the words of these eyewitnesses tell us that the Civil War had important transformative effects on Kansas. Most modern book and film treatments during the Civil War rarely refer to Kansas, except maybe when they mentioned Bleeding Kansas before the Civil War, and then they might mention the Lawrence Massacre of 1863, which I just alluded to at the beginning. But Kansas during the war years was more important than just those two incidents. Kansas was the newest state in the Union when the war broke out in 1861. And Kansas was part of what President Abraham Lincoln called the Great Interior Region of the country. This was an area encompassing parts of 12 states and 3 territories, situated in what today we call the Midwest and the Plains regions. While Kansas by itself probably was not crucial to the outcome of the war, historians in recent decades have shown that this great interior region, including the western edges of it, like Kansas, these historians have increasingly agreed with Lincoln that this region as a whole was important to the ultimate U.S. victory in the war, the saving of the United States and the abolition of slavery. There's another, maybe a little bit more provocative argument to be made that historians have made in recent years, and I tend to agree with them. There wasn't just one war being waged between 1861 and 1865. There was another war that was happening concurrently, and in some cases these two wars were intertwined. At the same time that Northerners are marching south to defeat the Confederacy and restore the southern states to the Union, Westerners are marching farther west, waging a war of conquest against the people that lived on the plains, in places like central and western Kansas. And in some cases, it was the same troops organized by the federal or the state governments fighting both of these wars. So it sort of complicates this common idea that we have of the Civil War as a good war. That might be a term you hear more often associated with World War II. But the fact that the war had, for at least most people consider to be a good outcome, right? But this narrative that I'm going to be telling you today complicates that a little bit. So what was Kansas like in 1861 at the outbreak of the war? Well, the story of Kansas during the war years is also a story of tremendous change, of drastic growth in population, diversity, and economics. In 1861, when Kansas first joined the Union, this baby state had only 107,000 residents. And the vast majority of them were concentrated along the eastern third of the state, which, as you can see from this map, is where all the towns were located. Now, jumping ahead to 4 years later, in 1865, soon after the Civil War ended, the state conducted its first state census. And it had some pretty interesting results. The population had grown to 142,000. And the population was now divided almost equally between men and women, which, when you think about it, is a pretty good indicator of things settling down. That this is turning from a frontier region into a settled region, where we're getting our normal institutions of statehood and things like that. And in fact, in some ways, the Kansas of the 1860s was more diverse than the Kansas of the 21st century. The state's population in 1865 included larger percentages of African Americans and Native Americans and immigrants, most of whom were European, in the state population. Unlike virtually any other state, Kansas had to grow up in a hurry. Most other states had decades or even centuries to develop the institutions of statehood, either as colonies or as territories, right? But for Kansas, it was boom, 1854, you're a territory. Boom, 1861, you're a state. Congratulations, figure it out. And so Kansas really entered the Union before it was ready. But it entered the Union in January 1861 for a very specific purpose. This is the secession winter, when a lot of the southern states are seceding from the Union to form a new nation, the Confederacy, which is dedicated to preserving and expanding human slavery. Kansas had recently adopted the Wyandotte Constitution, which banned slavery in the territory and then the state, well, what became the state. So when the bill for statehood came up in Congress, the remaining congressmen from those states that hadn't seceded were happy to admit Kansas as a state, to sort of balance out after so many of those southern states had left. Now, and Kansans were very proud of their new state. They felt a sense of destiny for their state. Senator James Lane, and I'll be talking more about him in a minute, in a speech in October 1861 in Leavenworth, he called Kansas the jewel in the cap of freedom. Because the state had entered the Union as part of the anti-slavery movement. So Kansans generally were anti-slavery. But at the same time that they felt all this pride about joining the Union, Kansans, to their humiliation, were having to accept donated goods from the eastern states. Food, money, clothing, because in January 1861 they were still coming out of a terrible drought. There was a horrible drought in which for over a year barely any rain fell in Kansas. As a result, reportedly 1/3 of the settlers pulled up and left, and another third wanted to leave but couldn't, reportedly. So things were very rough in Kansas. Leading Kansas historian Craig Minor and others have pointed out that the image of the lone and self-sufficient Western pioneer is misplaced. These folks did not come out to Kansas to go it on their own. They came out here to be part of communities, and in some cases they migrated out here as part of larger communities. As soon as they came out here and established towns like Lawrence, Topeka, Manhattan, Onaga came later, as you probably know, they wanted to establish communities and all the things that come with communities, like schools and churches, libraries, things like that. The territorial population was very diverse. It was representative of every state in the Union, northern and southern, and numerous European countries as well. And their opinions on politics and the issues of the day were nearly as varied. One early settler admitted many years later, quote, "We came to Kansas to better our conditions, incidentally expecting to make it a free state." So this idea has built up over the years, and it was very much perpetuated by some of the early leaders of Kansas, that people came out here to fight against slavery, right? We're going to stake a claim for human freedom out here on the plains. And most people who came out here, especially after 1856, were sympathetic to that idea. They were anti-slavery, at least in principle. But the main driver, the main factor pushing people out here, or pulling them out here, depending on how you think of it, was economics. So in the mid-19th century, people had very large families, and so they had a lot of kids. And usually the firstborn son got all the good stuff, right? So if you're living back east, you're probably living on a small farm with rocky soil. And as you have children, you got to sort of try to divide that up to keep them happy, right? Or give it all to the firstborn son. So the other kids got to go somewhere, right? So many of them, and the railroads are a big factor. I should mention that. That's a good reminder. Many of them come out here for land. That is probably the single biggest thing motivating people to come to Kansas in the early days. But the concept of a free state was a big draw as well. Organizations back east helped bankroll parties of settlers to come out here. And they established a set of communities along the Kansas River to serve as anchors for the free state movement. And that movement was successful, as I mentioned. Kansas grew up in fear and deprivation and hardship. Settlers in the early decades of Kansas statehood faced grueling hardships. They faced droughts, as I already mentioned. They faced floods. When it wasn't in drought, the land was probably flooding, right? They faced blizzards. They faced dust. They faced illnesses. There was the notorious Kansas itch, or the Kansas fever. They faced hunger. They faced poverty. They faced flies, grasshoppers, wolves. Attacks from so-called hostile Indian tribes or border ruffians from Missouri. They faced loneliness and ennui on the prairie. They faced, nostalgia for their homes back east. And they faced extreme heat and cold. One early settler said that it would be warm enough to sleep naked in bed, and the next hour cold enough to freeze the tail off the dogs. Transportation facilities were very primitive and crude. Only Leavenworth was connected to the outside world via telegraph, the fastest mode of communication of the day. The rivers were largely unnavigable. There were only a few dozen miles of railroad track in the state at the beginning of the war. Some settlements were 60 miles from the nearest post office. So it was easy to have a feeling of isolation out here on the plains. So, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, was elected president in November 1860. Most Kansans were on his side. As you can see in this headline from, I believe it was an Atchison the White Cloud Kansas Chief, one of my favorite newspaper titles of all time. It says, "Whoopee!" Because apparently the editor of the White Cloud Kansas Chief was pretty happy about Lincoln's election. This inflamed the feelings of a lot of Southerners, and that's when we see that secession winter. All these states in the South start to leave the Union and form the Confederate States of America. And then the Civil War breaks out in April 1861. And Kansans are worried. They support the Union, of course, for the most part. Kansans support the Union. But Kansas shares a 200-mile-long border with Missouri, a slave state. And especially in western Missouri, there's a lot of hostility toward people who are sympathetic with anti-slavery, people who don't want slavery. And there's a lot of antagonism toward Kansans. So they're worried that if Missouri were to leave the Union, then Kansas might be cut off from the other eastern and northern states. President Abraham Lincoln called for, initially for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion in the South. And of course, later on, he called for many more times that number. Initially, this troop call did not include Kansas. Federal troops stationed at places like Fort Riley and Fort Scott were pulled east to fight in the Civil War. So the Kansans were expected to basically take care of themselves during this war. Eventually, Kansas was included in subsequent troop calls. Reverend Richard Cordley, who was a congregational minister in Lawrence being one of the first towns established in Kansas, later on said, "The people of Kansas regarded the war as the inevitable sequence of the events which had preceded it. It was only a continuation of the struggle which had been going on in Kansas for 6 years." He went on to say, "Kansas therefore had everything at stake. The success of the rebellion would mean the destruction of Kansas. It was exposed to all the perils of a hostile frontier. It responded, therefore, to the nation's call for troops with an alacrity seldom witnessed. Her sons pressed into the service until her prairies were desolate and her homes almost deserted." Unquote. And that is only a slight exaggeration on the part of Reverend Cordley. Kansas may have had, in fact, probably did have the highest per capita rate of service during the war. About 20,000 men out of 30,000 of military age in the state served in the war, or represented Kansas in service. And it's a little misleading because they weren't all, not all the men serving in the Kansas regiments and companies were actually from Kansas. Some of them were recruited from as far east as Chicago or Ohio, but they represented Kansas in the military, so they count toward that percentage. And I mentioned how Kansans felt very invested in this Civil War, and they felt a sense of destiny and purpose for their new state, which is why Senator Lane called Kansas the jewel in the cap of freedom. Kansas was a young state full of young people. Because it was so hard to get out of here, across the prairie, as a pioneer, about 90% of Kansans were under 40 years of age. And over 40% were between 20 and 40. The majority of the state legislators in Topeka, population 700, were in their 20s and 30s. And journalists sometimes referred to the state legislature as the boys. And they would report on raucous sessions in the legislature where if a speaker was sort of being boring up on the stand, they would throw paper wads at him to get him down, right? It was that sort of atmosphere. During the secession crisis and the war's early years, influential Kansans, like newspaper editors who were very important people in their communities, and politicians, all spoke about unity. They pledged to put aside their partisan divides, which were very severe in the mid-19th century. Politics was everywhere. If anything, even more than it is today, right? They pledged to put these partisan divides aside and stand together to defend and preserve the Union in the war. This attitude lasted for about 5 minutes, because almost immediately the sense of unity, especially among politicians, broke down. Now, Kansas was overwhelmingly Republican. There were Democrats in the state, but the leaders in the state, in the state government, were mostly Republican. The party of Lincoln and the party of anti-slavery. There were basically two factions that developed during the war years, and the political partisanship in the state really colored how things happened in the state of Kansas in the war effort. One faction was led by Governor Charles Robinson, the first governor of the state of Kansas, a Lawrence resident. Another faction was led by James Henry Lane, one of the first senators of Kansas. And these two guys hated each other's guts. Lane was also a Lawrence resident, so it must have been awkward when they met each other in the streets. They could not stand each other. Robinson was the more conservative of the two in that he was anti-slavery, but he wasn't like a full-fledged abolitionist. And Lane at least pretended to be sympathetic to African Americans and abolitionists. And he certainly worked toward freeing them as part of the war effort. Lane is a very interesting guy. I probably could spend this entire lecture just talking about him. He was from Indiana. He served as an officer in the Mexican-American War. He came out to Kansas in the 1850s to fight in the Bleeding Kansas battle, and he basically reinvented himself as an anti-slavery warrior and leader for the cause. So he's a pretty prominent individual, but he has, a few little eccentricities, such as he walks around everywhere in all types of weather wearing a buffalo robe for whatever reason. And if he didn't have this hat on in this photo, you would see his hair was really wild. He kind of looked like Einstein, right? He was a very powerful orator at a time when being a good speech maker was very important as a politician. But reportedly, he would get so animated as he gave a speech that he would start to take his clothes off as he spoke. And I don't know how far he got in that transition. I hope not very far. But that was something that he was known to do. In 1857, he shot and killed a fellow Lawrence resident in a land dispute. And reportedly, Lane was haunted by this murder from then on. He would wake up from horrible nightmares thinking about this killing that he had perpetrated. He was not punished for this, by the way. Governor Robinson was quite a bit more calm than Lane was, okay? So Lane, at the very beginning of actually before the Civil War, March 1861, the state legislature in Topeka is electing its representatives. And in those days, the senators were appointed by the legislature, not elected by the people. So the story goes that Lane is sitting on a couch in front of the legislative chamber, and he's up for debate or selection as one of the first two senators. And the story goes that he is just sweating bullets. He's racked with anxiety about how this vote might go. And the doors open, and it's announced that Lane has been elected or appointed one of our first two senators. And at that point, he pulled a pistol from out of his clothing and said that if the vote had gone the other way, he would have blown his own brains out. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you one of our first two senators for the state of Kansas. The other early senator was Samuel Pomeroy, comparatively not as interesting as Lane, but more stable as an individual, you might say. So Lane went east to serve in the Senate, and when the war began in April 1861, he did a very smart thing. He formed this unit of militiamen made up of Kansans and other Westerners who happened to be in the capital. A good many of them were probably office seekers. And he called them the Frontier Guard. And they posted guard at the White House and around Washington, D.C. Because there were very few federal troops to defend the Capitol when the war broke out. And it was said that from that point on, Lane had the ear of President Lincoln. And Lincoln would side with him in just about every dispute that came up. And there were a lot of disputes in Lane's career. So at that point, he's never one to really worry about legal technicalities, Lane. He somehow, even though he's a serving U.S. Senator, he gets a commission as a Brigadier General in the Army from the state of Indiana, his home state, and he comes back to Kansas, and he starts to form regiments of troops to defend Kansas, but more especially to march into Missouri and clean out those damn secessionists and free every slave they can find and bring them back to freedom in Kansas. And Kansans are in love with this idea. They cheer Lane at every speech he gives about this avenging mission he's going to launch into Missouri. Also, some other people that we had in Kansas. Daniel R. Anthony was an influential man in Leavenworth, which was the largest city in Kansas. He was the owner and publisher of a newspaper called the Leavenworth Daily Conservative, which despite its title was not conservative. It was politically radical in that it was an abolitionist newspaper. And in 1861, Anthony met a rival newspaper editor on the streets of Leavenworth and shot and killed the man. And he escaped prosecution for this crime. Are you starting to sense a theme here with some of these Kansas leaders? He became the second in command of a regiment formed during the Civil War. A regiment had between 10 and 12 companies of men, so around 1,000 to 1,200 men when it was first organized. These companies were formed in different communities, and then they would be banded together into regiments. Anthony was second in command of a regiment called the 7th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, also confusingly called the 1st Kansas Cavalry. I have no idea why, but better known as Jennison's Jayhawkers. Kansans were already being identified as Jayhawkers at this time. We'll talk more about what that term Jayhawker meant at that time. The colonel, the commanding officer of the 7th Kansas, was Charles Jennison, better known as Doc Jennison. He had a medical degree that he didn't ever practice anymore. He lived down in Mound City in southeastern Kansas. Jennison was a bit of a troublemaker because the 7th Kansas Cavalry, Jennison's Jayhawkers, became known as possibly the most problematic, undisciplined bunch of soldiers in U.S. military history. They basically took the war to Southern civilians without authorization from the federal government or the state of Kansas. And they gained a pretty good reputation for lacking discipline, for plundering, for stealing goods, for killing civilians, and something that particularly enraged white Southerners, they would help enslaved people liberate themselves and come back into Kansas in freedom. That really angered supporters of the Confederacy. However, a lot of people at the time noted that Jennison was rarely in command of his men. He was usually back in Kansas playing poker while all this was happening. And the regiment was actually led in the field by Daniel Anthony as lieutenant colonel. The Anthony name might be familiar to you because he was the brother of Susan B. Anthony, the suffragist leader. I'll talk more about the 7th Kansas here in a little while. Another interesting state leader we had was James Montgomery, also a resident of Mound City. He had been a leader of Free State forces in the Bleeding Kansas dispute before the Civil War. And his band were engaged in some pretty extra-legal activities, and federal troops were actually sent in pursuit of Montgomery's band of fighters. In 1860, his band caught and hanged a pro-slavery man. And this is how Montgomery explained it, quote, "He was a drunken border ruffian, worth a good deal to hang, but good for nothing else. He had caught a fugitive slave and carried him back to Missouri for the sake of a reward. He was condemned by a jury of 12 men, the law being found in the 16th verse of Exodus 21. Apparently Montgomery was a pretty pious guy. He was also a minister. So that's apparently how he justified that execution. He led a regiment in a brigade that was commanded by James Lane, General James Lane. This was known as the Kansas Brigade. And they actually kind of put the members of Jennison's Jayhawkers to shame, because if anything, they were even more outrageous in their behavior when they invaded Missouri. I'm just going to take a little sip of water here. Historians have shown that what began as a limited war to preserve the Union eventually expanded into a war that was also about freedom. 1863, well, really late 1862 on, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union war effort became also about ending slavery. But here's the thing. Kansans understood what was really at stake when the Civil War began. They were actually ahead of Lincoln and most white Northerners in their understanding about the issues that were at stake. Kansans were largely anti-slavery. And I already mentioned how Lane and Montgomery and officers like them would march into Missouri, and one of the things that they were notorious for doing was not respecting the property rights of white Southerners. They would help enslaved people come back into Kansas in freedom. Before this was official U.S. policy, this caused a lot of controversy early on. But Kansans understood exactly what was at stake. They understood, even if many of them, the white Kansans, were not necessarily thinking about like racial equality, even if that wasn't on their radar, they understood that to defeat the Confederacy, you had to knock out that base of support that the enslaved working population was providing. With so many of these folks working in the fields and things like that, a large percentage about 80% of white Southern men were able to fight in the war for the Confederacy. So if you were to help these enslaved individuals become free and flee to the Union lines, you would be knocking out that base of support. That would be possibly a war-winning factor for the Union cause. And eventually, by the fall of 1862, Lincoln had come around to this understanding. So Kansans were ahead of the curve there. But why did most men fight in the war? Well, there were probably as many different reasons to serve as there were men from Kansas who served, right? They're all individuals, they all have their different motives and beliefs. But for my money, Reuben Smith, who was a resident of Osawatomie, gave one of the best explanations for why he served, or why somebody like him would serve. Reuben Smith was 28 years old when the Civil War began. He was a native of England. He had staked a claim in Osawatomie only a few years earlier, but he was already a leading citizen of that area. He enlisted as a private in August 1861, and he went on to serve as an officer. And later on, he served as a spy along the Kansas-Missouri border during a Confederate invasion. And here's what Reuben Smith said in his diary about why he chose to enlist. "I hate war, and have hoped all along that the passions of the Southern people would not bring it upon us. But it is here, and I, as an American citizen, intend to meet it and to do my duty to my adopted country. When I left England, my native place, it was to live in a free country and under a republican form of government." And just as an aside, by republican he means small r republican. He wants to live in a republic, like the United States. "And although I have not found America all that I desired or hoped for, yet I do not hesitate to say that it is by far the freest and the best country on earth. Believing that a republican form of government is now for the last time on trial, and further believing that at the wind-up of this rebellion that human slavery will be abolished, and that if we fail, slavery will be perpetuated, I cast my lot on due reflection on the side of freedom." Unquote. Not everyone had such high-minded ideals when they enlisted, though. One officer recruited men in Lawrence with a promise that they would be more likely to be killed by lightning than by Confederates if they joined his outfit. So, people had different motives for serving in various units. Columbus Griffith was a young man living in the southern part of the state. He lived also in Mound City. That little town is coming up quite a bit in this lecture. He was a farmer, very young man, about like mid-20s. He had a wife and a boy and a son and a daughter. And he enlisted in August 1861, actually August 1862, in the 2nd Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, another of the regiments that was organized. Now I mentioned before that these regiments were composed of companies, and a company had about 100 soldiers when it was first organized. And these were recruited in different communities because the federal government didn't have a large infrastructure, so it relied on community leaders to form these military units, to do the recruiting in the organization. So this had a lot of advantages. It was great for community pride and for soldier morale to serve with your relatives and your neighbors, right? We can all understand why that would be a motivating factor. But there was a problem with that kind of organization too. Because if a regiment went into a very severe battle, like the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August 1861, the first large battle that Kansans fought in, an entire community of young men might be wiped out. So newspapers would print these long lists of the casualties in a particular company or regiment after a battle. And it's easy to imagine people in a town like Atchison, where one of these companies for the 1st Kansas Infantry was formed, would be scanning that list and probably recognize every single name on that list. And if you were lucky, it wouldn't be your brother or your husband or your son on that list. So this is a tremendously dangerous undertaking that these men are taking when they go into service. Over 20% of the men who served in the Civil War died during their service, and many thousands died immediately after their service from illness or wounds. Kansans very early on developed certain reputations. They developed reputations for being poorly disciplined in service. for basically doing whatever they wanted in the field and for taking the war to Southern civilians. Because remember, they've lived under the threat of so-called border ruffians from places like Missouri ever since 1854. So they see the Civil War as a time of revenge. So we get outfits like Jennison's Jayhawkers recruited, who take the war to enemy civilians. But the Civil War is a very diverse affair for Kansans. Initially, the federal government only recruited white men. They were the only ones allowed to serve in the war. However, in August 1862, James Henry Lane, who is still a general serving along the Kansas-Missouri border, apparently acting under the principle that it was better to act first and ask for forgiveness later, he starts recruiting a regiment of enslaved or formerly enslaved African-American men down at Fort Scott. This is the rendezvous point, and all these freedom seekers who are coming in from Missouri and other southern states, and they're joining up at Fort Scott, and they're enlisted in the Army under General Lane. And eventually the War Department acquiesced to this and formed them as the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. Confusingly, there was also a 1st Kansas White Infantry. And later on, they were renamed the 79th U.S. Colored Troops. Now, this was a very controversial thing to do at the time. A lot of people said we shouldn't be enlisting blacks to fight in the war. In October 1862, General Blunt, who was in command down at Fort Scott, said, well, up to that point, he had said, these men are only going to be used for manual labor and for guard duty. They're not going to be sent into combat. But the situation along the Kansas-Missouri border is so volatile and so precarious that he has no choice but to send them into the fight. In October 1862, a report comes out that there are Confederate guerrilla fighters active in Butler, Missouri, around the area of Butler, Missouri, and which is right along the border with Kansas, or pretty close to the border. So several companies of the 1st Kansas Colored Troops are sent up to deal with this situation. They're not even mustered into federal service yet. They shouldn't be fighting. They're not officially soldiers yet, right? But they're sent up there. They go to a place called the Toothman Farm, which is at an area called Island Mound. And they come up against these Confederate guerrillas. These guerrillas are mounted on horseback, and they're armed with multiple 6-shot revolvers. They're armed to the teeth, right? These Kansas Colored soldiers, as they were known, have antiquated smoothbore single-shot muskets, and they're on foot. So, and they're lined up, and the guerrilla fighters are on the other side of the field, and they're shouting all these taunts and epithets at the Kansans, saying, come on, fight us, and shouting all these racial insults, things like that. The 1st Kansas marches into the battle and defeats the Confederate guerrillas in their very first engagement. And the news of this victory at Island Mound spreads across the country. It's reported in all the newspapers. And at this State Museum in Topeka, which should be reopening soon, hopefully, you can see, or at least they have in their possession, a flag that was carried at Island Mound, which I think is pretty cool. Also, when the war began, south of Kansas is what is called an area called Indian Territory, what we today call Oklahoma. And there's quite a diverse collection of these tribes that have been pushed into that area by Western expansion by the white population. And Confederate agents are in Indian Territory, and they're stirring up a lot of trouble. They're trying to convince the Native Americans to join the side of the Confederacy. And they have a great deal of success, particularly with the Cherokees and the Choctaws. However, there are Native Americans in Indian Territory who don't want to side with the Confederacy. And the Confederate-aligned Native Americans and Confederate troops attack them and push them north. And there's a long, epic, grueling march that these people go on into safety in Kansas. And this is a diverse collection of peoples from various tribes, like the Creeks, the Chickasaws, the Cherokees, the Osages, the Seminoles, the Quapaws, the Kickapoos, and several other nations. They're settled by the federal government in these really terrible, squalid camps along the Neosho River. They suffer from disease, they suffer from hunger, many of them die. And in the summer of 1862, the federal government decides to enlist the men in the army. You might think if you were a Native American your attitude might be, well, screw you. Like, why would I want to do this, right? But many of them did enlist. They formed 3 regiments that were called Indian Home Guards. And these men were very effective combatants, particularly in Indian Territory. They went back into Indian Territory, and under General Blunt's leadership, they were able to save Indian Territory for the Union and drive out the Confederates. Jennison's Jayhawkers, I mentioned they had pretty controversial leadership. Later on, one of their commanders that came to the forefront was a young man named George Henry Hoyt. He had been John Brown's defending counsel at his trial after the Harper's Ferry raid in 1859, and he was an avowed abolitionist. He was known as a good hater because he hated slaveholders, and he took the war to the enemy and in the civilian communities in Missouri and states like that. Later on, when Doc Jennison, who commanded the 7th Kansas, he resigned his commission after he got in trouble for all this behavior that he was doing in Missouri. Later on, he formed another regiment. He was brought back into the Army, and George Henry Hoyt became his second in command. And together they really waged a pretty vicious struggle against Confederate guerrillas. So, does anyone recognize this young man here in this photograph on the bottom? So, you might recognize his name, William F. Cody, better known in later years as Buffalo Bill. In 1864, when he was only 17 years old, he was a resident of Leavenworth, and he enlisted in Jennison's Jayhawkers, the 7th Kansas Cavalry. And that's how he became he started his career with the Army and eventually gained fame as a scout for the U.S. Army after the war, during the wars with the Plains Indian tribes. So,
And who else?
what's that?
And who else?
Who else?
Was it Hickok, a member of that?
He was. I don't know that Hickok was regularly enrolled as a soldier, but he was a teamster for a time, I think, and he was also a scout for the Army. Yeah. So William D. Matthews was a barber in Topeka and in Leavenworth, excuse me, and he also worked owning a boarding house, and he was a station master on the Underground Railroad, bringing enslaved people into freedom in the North. He served as a recruiter for the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. But he was determined to serve himself, and he was expected to become an officer, although there were no blacks allowed to be commissioned as officers in the U.S. Army at first. Eventually, he did serve as an officer in what was called the Independent Battery of U.S. Artillery, and he helped to defend Kansas during a raid in 1864, a Confederate invasion in 1864. Okay, I am rapidly running out of time, I think, so I'm going to have to speed through these last slides a little bit. For most Kansans, the war was a guerrilla conflict. Most Kansas troops served along the Kansas-Missouri border. Because remember, for the most part, this area has been stripped of federal troops. So they've been essentially forced to defend their own border. And it was it turned into the most savage guerrilla conflict of the entire Civil War, probably in almost all of American history. The most notorious incident, of course, was the Lawrence Massacre that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. William C. Quantrill, who led this attack on Lawrence, ironically, he was a Northerner by birth, and he'd actually lived in Lawrence before the Civil War. He came to the forefront as probably the most notorious Confederate guerrilla leader in Missouri. And guerrilla warfare had already been a hallmark of conflict in Kansas ever since Bleeding Kansas. So Kansans, consider themselves very prepared to wage this kind of fight. George W. Packard, a young man who served in Jennison's Jayhawkers, he wrote his mother in June 1863, and I love the fact that he's saying this in a letter to his mother. Our company has never been surprised by them for the fact that we are always on the alert. We have adopted their rule is to take no prisoners, leave no wounded men. There is no other way to fight bushwhackers. Extermination is our motto. We hunt them like wolves and are fast ridding the country of them. Now this was a bit of bravado on George's part, because they were not ridding the country of the bushwhackers. This was an ever-present menace, one that grew until almost the very end of the war. Now, Federal authorities in Missouri and Kansas came in for a lot of flack for letting the Lawrence Massacre to happen on their watch. Governor Thomas Kearney in Topeka spent tens of thousands of dollars of his own money to outfit a new regiment. A second Jennison's Jayhawkers, if you will, led again by Doc Jennison, who was brought into service after his bad behavior earlier in the war. Bloody Bill Anderson, by the way, he was a Kansan. He was from Council Grove, but he served as a lieutenant, you might say, under Quantrill. The two guys didn't like each other. Bloody Bill was too intense even for Quantrill, so eventually they parted ways. Anderson was known for riding around with Union sympathizers' scalps tied to the bridle of his horse. So that gives you a little sense of why he was called Bloody Bill. Yes, did you have a question?
Yeah, what was the population of Lawrence when that occurred, and then how many actually got killed?
Yeah, the population of Lawrence was between 2,500 and 3,000, probably closer to 3,000. And anywhere from 150 to 200 men and boys were killed in the raid. So that was probably like around 40% of the adult male population. It was a pretty devastating blow on this community. We don't know how many people died because a lot of people in town were just passing through. And not everyone knew the names of all the victims. And there were a lot of African-American people who had come from slavery and were either staying in Lawrence or passing through on their way to the north. And there were also a lot of German immigrants in town as well. So the town was in a bit of flux. And a lot of the bodies were burned up in the flames. So not all the bodies could be identified after the raid. So yeah, we're not sure exactly how many people died. Some people have characterized the Lawrence Massacre as the worst incidents of domestic terrorism in U.S. history until the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. I think it kind of depends on your definition of a terrorist attack. There are many other attacks in American history that could fall under that listing, possibly. So I don't know. That's kind of a matter of opinion. For Kansans, the war years only elevated the fear, anxiety, and isolation that they felt during the Bleeding Kansas days. But as many people remarked during the war years, the hardships of the frontier and the territorial days had also made Kansans tough and resilient. And Kansans believed that these qualities made them better combatants and more hardy folks working on the home front for the war effort. Also, something very impressive during the war years. Kansans and the rest of Americans, of course, all the other Americans, they're not only fighting a war, they're having to continue the concerns of peacetime. This is especially true in the northern states. For the Confederacy, they're mostly consumed by the war. They have to concentrate on the war the entire time. But for Northerners, including Kansans, they're keeping up these institutions of civilian life. There are still plays being put on. There are still concerts. There are still school sessions, right? There are still all the institutions of civilian life. There are still factories turning out goods. Farming is going on, all these things. And at the same time, they've sent their men off to war, right? So this is kind of impressive that they're able to carry on their lives during wartime. And it really brings me back to that point I made at the beginning where, despite this terrible war raging along the Kansas-Missouri border, the state population actually grows. There are agents that travel over to Europe representing Kansas, enticing European immigrants to come over and settle in Kansas. So many men have marched away to war that initially there's a minor recession in the state. And until they get that under control, more people emigrate into the state. And in many cases, women take to the fields. Girls and women take to the fields. Occupations that in many cases they hadn't engaged in before the war, to bring in the crops, right? And to be the breadwinners for their families. Governor Robinson's wife, Sarah Robinson, sort of epitomizes the hardships and the anxieties that people felt on the home front during the war. Charles was very sickly during his time as governor from 1861 to 63. In 1863, due to the machinations of Lane and his faction, Robinson was impeached because of a bond scandal that probably wasn't actually his fault. But while he was governor, he suffered from illnesses a lot. And there are letters preserved at the State Archives in Topeka from Sarah to Charles and from Charles to Sarah, in which Sarah begs him for permission to come and tend to him in Topeka. And Charles writes his wife in Lawrence saying, no, it's too dangerous for you to come out here. So, and Charles and Sarah barely survived, or at least Charles barely survived the Lawrence massacre. He hid out in their stone barn when this was going on. And Sarah later on wrote a very evocative account of the raid. She was known as a very accomplished writer and historian. So I mentioned that there's a lot of immigration into the state. Most of the immigrants arrived in small family groups, but there were a number of large colonies of immigrants that migrated to Kansas. And of course, this especially picks up after the war years, when it's safer to migrate to the United States and out to Kansas. But this is going on during the war years as well. So after an initial period of recession, as I mentioned, by 1862-63, things are, the economy is under control in Kansas, and the state is becoming something of a breadbasket for the Union. The crops are really fruitful. In fact, one newspaper down along the Neosho River in one of those communities down there actually said that the war was proving to be a godsend for Kansas because of all the money that was coming in for the farmers. The military built up its bases at places like Fort Riley and Fort Scott and built new bases like Fort Larned out to the west. So farmers concentrated on raising cash crops and on livestock that they could sell to the army. And this helped to boost the state's economy quite a bit. Kansans high and low suffered from the war's effects. The war ended in 1865. The Union was saved. The enslaved people were freed, and people were left to pick up the pieces, essentially. Columbus Griffith, who I mentioned toward the beginning, his son and wife died while he was away serving in the 2nd Kansas Cavalry. So he was forced to send, his daughter and his wife died. He was forced to send his toddler-aged son to live with the boy's grandparents while he was in service. He came home from service in May 1865. You can read some of his letters online, and he talks after the war about having to pick up the pieces, as I already mentioned. He goes back to farming. He purchases a McCormick Reaper, a very state-of-the-art harvesting technology for the time, and he gets right back to work in the fields. Kansas, in 1867, 2 years after the war ended, posted its first 1 million bushel wheat crop. And within 10 years, that figure had grown by 1,000%. Kansas was truly a breadbasket for the nation now. And this, in some ways, is a legacy of the war years. James Lane had a very different legacy. Columbus Griffith, by the way, remarried and he lived until 1907, so he lived a very long life. James Lane continued in the Senate after he resigned from his commission as a general in the Army. In 1866, after the war, he ran afoul of this group who were known as the Radical Republicans. And he came back to Kansas and he was sort of depressed, very likely mentally ill, and he shot himself to death. In Lawrence, if you go to Oak Hill Cemetery, his family monument was the very first one that was placed in that cemetery. And here he's posing with his wife, Mary, his long-suffering wife, Mary Elizabeth. She had a very difficult time after Lane died. She raised canaries for a living after the senator died. So this painting depicts some of the fallout from the Lawrence Massacre. Back in August of 1863, I know I'm jumping around a lot in my chronology, so forgive me. General Ewing, who was in command along the border, General Thomas Ewing, he issued Order Number 11, which was an attempt to clamp down on the guerrilla menace in western Missouri and Kansas. This order basically cleaned out the civilian population from 4 counties in western Missouri, forced them to uproot themselves and leave and move somewhere else to basically clear out that base of support that the federal authorities thought the guerrillas were enjoying in that area. This stretch of 4 counties became known as the Burnt District. And if you talk to people in western Missouri, basically their attitude is like, this was our Lawrence Massacre. This was the atrocity that we suffered during the war years. As late as the 1950s, a historian by the name of Albert Castell, he talked about going into western Missouri, and people would talk about this event like it happened yesterday. They were still very inflamed about this event. Hundreds of people were probably killed in this forced eviction. And the Kansas troops who were carrying this out, in many cases, were only too happy to do this to the civilians in western Missouri. So this painting, by the way, was by George Caleb Bingham, the famous Missouri artist who hated Kansans, and he really wanted to stick it to General Ewing. So he made this painting, which, for better or worse, captures our popular memory of Order Number 11, part of the fallout of the Lawrence Massacre. When the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry mustered out of service in Leavenworth in October 1865, only about 500 of the 1,500 men who had served in the regiment were still in the ranks to be mustered out. A leading black resident of Leavenworth, John H. Morris, was asked to address the soldiers when they mustered out. At the commencement of the war, he told them, few anticipated the great and momentous changes so soon to be wrought by it. Now that nearly 200,000 black men had helped to save the Union and abolish slavery, Morris asked, what is to be their future political status? And that was a very good question. A lot of people were asking that question when the war ended. What were these people owed after the war? In 1860, there had been only 816 black residents of Kansas Territory. By 1865, the state had 12,000 black residents. In 1867, 2 years after the war ended, 2 bills came up before the state legislature. One would have amended the Constitution, the state Constitution, to give women the right to vote. The other would have given black men the right to vote. And the voters of Kansas, who at that time were all white men, shot down both of these measures. The women's suffrage bill, by far the greatest majority, was shot down by them. It took until 1870, when we got the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, for black men to have the right to vote. And then not until 1912 were Kansas women afforded equal voting rights with men. So not everyone was so thrilled with these great and momentous changes that the war years had wrought. But it's a complicated story. David Ware had served in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. After the war, he became a janitor at the State House in Topeka. When he died in 1885, the flag at the State House was lowered to half-mast, and the legislatures observed a moment of silence in his honor. But this is happening at the same time that a lot of communities in Kansas are adopting segregation laws. And some communities are becoming sundown communities because they don't want African Americans in their midst, or they don't want them to have the same rights. A man named Pap Singleton had helped lead the Exoduster movement into Kansas after Reconstruction of the South ended in 1877. Tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people came to Kansas. You could book passage on a steamboat or a train for as little as $1 to make it up here. Many of them became farmers at places like Nicodemus to the west, things like that. But not everyone in Kansas was thrilled when they moved here. So, you know, the war had a complicated legacy. Yes, this was a free state. Yes, Kansans were anti-slavery. But how far were they willing to take it after the war? That was a big question. Kansans, during and after the war, were railroad crazy. They wanted railroads. Railroads were a symbol of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad that came after the Civil War was seen as the triumph of Union loyalists in the war effort and a symbol of freedom and prosperity. During the groundbreaking ceremony for the Union Pacific Railway Company Eastern Division, which was sort of a spur line, if I'm using that terminology correctly. I'm not a railroad man. For the coming transcontinental railroad. Construction began on the Kansas-Missouri state line in September 1863. And they had a ceremony to mark the occasion of constructing this line that was going to go across Kansas. The foreman, a man named H.H. Sawyer, he drove into the ground a post marking the westward start of construction. He then marked the stake with red chalk. On the Missouri side of the post, he wrote slavery. And on the Kansas side, he wrote liberty. So that's an example of the symbology of the railroads coming to Kansas. In 1865, Kansas had only 71 miles of railroad track. 5 years later, that figure had increased more than 17-fold, and a rail line now reached across the state and on into Denver. By 1889, Kansas had more railroad track per capita than any U.S. state or country in the world. Perhaps more than any other single innovation, railroads made Kansas what it became after the Civil War. A very different place than it had been before the war. And of course, that's how Onaga got its start, as a stop on the railroad, right? The Civil War saved the United States and abolished slavery, but it was a calamity for Native Americans. Because, of course, there were people already living on the land where Kansans wanted the railroad to run. And during and after the Civil War, the federal and the state authorities used the pretext that some of these peoples had at least tacitly supported the Confederacy, or at least not fought for the Union, to enact these treaties that essentially drove them off their land. Treaties like the Medicine Lodge Treaties in 1868, and in 1867 and 68. And it was by measures like this that the railroad came to Kansas. Now that narrative that I just presented is a little oversimplified. By no means were all Native Americans forced to leave the state. There was a woman named Ellen Pappan Curtis who had Kaw ancestry. She retained a tract of land that later became part of the expansion of Topeka. Her husband served as a Union officer during the Civil War. And her son, Charles Curtis, inherited this property, and he went on to wealth and in a political career. He became Vice President of the United States. Okay, last slide, I promise. So, 1865 marked the point when western Kansas opened up for settlement by the white population. And settlers pour into the state. Many of them are former soldiers in the Union Army. Kansas becomes known as the Great Soldier State because there were so many veterans living in the state. 11 out of the 13 governors of Kansas in the 35 years after the war were former Union Army officers. That shows you how much political power these veterans had. But not all veterans were male. Mary Ann Ball Bickerdike had been a nurse for the Union Army during the war years. And at one point, she was a very hard worker, very dedicated to nursing those sick and wounded soldiers. At one point, an officer had gone to General Sherman and said, you know, this nurse Bickerdike contradicted one of my orders. And Sherman said, I can't do anything about it. She outranks me. So she was a very effective nurse during the war. After the war years, Mother Bickerdike, as she was affectionately known, she helped lead a movement of veterans and widows and their children to settle in Kansas. She helped bring thousands of these folks out to Kansas. She established a home for veterans' families and former Union Army nurses outside of Ellsworth. It became known as the Mother Bickerdike Home. And if you go to Ellsworth today, on a little hillside overlooking the town, is a cemetery that's very well maintained where a lot of these former nurses are buried. Mother Bickerdike isn't buried there. She's buried farther east, I think in Illinois. But she was possibly the most beloved person to serve in the war who lived in Kansas after the war years. So I'm going to close with something that Colonel Samuel J. Crawford, who was a veteran and later a governor of Kansas, said when he wrote his memoirs in 1911. He said, "War is a relic of barbarism and should be remanded to the Dark Ages," which is something I agree with. But this war, in many ways, was the making of Kansas. So that's my talk. Thanks for joining me. I don't know if you have any time. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer them. Go ahead.
So where is that monument located in Topeka?
Yeah, that's in Topeka Cemetery. So that's what it's called, Topeka Cemetery. It's probably the biggest and most historic cemetery in the city. The 2nd Kansas State Militia have an interesting story. So there was a Confederate invasion of Missouri that was approaching Kansas in October of 1864, and Governor Kearny called out the state militia, which of course were the ordinary citizens of Kansas. But this shows you how politicized everything was. People were like, "Hold on, Governor." Opponents of Governor Kearny were like, "Hold on, Governor. So you're telling me you're calling out all these men to serve outside the state just before the elections? That seems a little fishy, right?" So there was a lot of pushback about calling out the militia when the state was about to be invaded, right? But about 10 to 20,000 Kansans served to counter this invasion. The state, and the commanding general said that they were little better than a rabble. They were mostly in civilian clothes. They wore sprigs of sumac in their hats to serve as an identifying marker. And most of them did not fight, but the 2nd Kansas militia did fight in countering this invasion, and they did suffer pretty severely. So even though they only served for about 20 days, the veterans put up this pretty impressive monument in Topeka Cemetery.
Who's the officer? Who's the serviceman? Has he got a name?
No, so there were companies in the post-war years that made these monuments, and you could actually buy a monument that was based on a certain design. And often they would have different models of soldier that you could have placed on the top of the monument. You might want to have a soldier that had a mustache like this guy. You might want to have one that was clean shaven. You might want to have him wearing an overcoat like this, or you might want him in a different uniform, something like that. So this is pretty much a standard design, that soldier at the top. Although the bottom with that inscription is very specifically talking about the 2nd Kansas Militia and what they did in 1864. And several of the veterans, I should add, are buried around this monument. Yeah, go ahead.
2 things. Andersons lived closer to Agnes City than Council Grove, didn't they? Bill Anderson.
I read that it was Council Grove, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
You had a slide that depicted Edmund G. Ross, but you didn't comment on it.
Oh, sure, yeah. So Ross, Edmund G. Ross was the Senate. He has an interesting story. He replaced Lane in the Senate after Lane committed suicide. So Ross was a Republican, and he was a former resident of Topeka. Well, his family were residents of Topeka, I should say. He's most famous because during President Johnson's impeachment trial in 1868, Ross cast the deciding vote to not remove Johnson from the presidency. It was decided by a single vote, and it was our senator for Kansas who voted to keep Johnson in office. And President Kennedy, many, many years later, he wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, which some of you may have read in school or at least heard of. And Ross was one of these profiles in courage that Kennedy wrote about, talking about how he stood up against the peer pressure from the radical Republicans to vote according to his conscience and not remove Johnson from office. Historians in later years have taken a different tack, and some of them have argued that probably Ross was bribed to vote the way he did. So there's a little bit of controversy around Edmund Ross now. But he's another example of the effects of the war for Kansans in the post-war years. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Okay. So our next event will be